My name is Jessica. For a long time, I was a woman who defined her worth through the happiness of others, a wife, a best friend, a peacemaker. I believed that if I gave the world my best, the world would return that kindness. But on my 40th birthday, I learned that even the most beautiful gardens can hide the sharpest thorns. Before I share the story of how my world shattered, and how I rebuilt it from the ashes, I want to take a moment to speak to you, my dear viewers. Thank you for being here. In a world full of noise, I am truly humbled that you've chosen to spend your precious time with me. It is a privilege to share these journeys of the resilient human spirit with such a thoughtful community. If this story touches your soul, or if you've ever felt the sting of betrayal only to find your own hidden strength, I humbly invite you to subscribe to Queen's Revenge. It would be an absolute honor to have you walk this path of transformation with me. To those of you who have already joined our family and subscribed, thank you for your incredible support. May your lives be blessed with an abundance of wealth, may your paths be cleared of all obstacles, and may your hearts overflow with a happiness that is both deep and everlasting. Now, let us begin. The candles were lit, the champagne was poured, and I was smiling, unaware that the two people I loved most were about to turn my celebration into a funeral. The air inside Lou Blanc was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the lingering trail of vintage Bollinger, an atmosphere of curated perfection that I had spent years cultivating as the hallmark of my life. At 40, I felt as though I had finally ascended to the summit of a mountain I had been climbing since my youth. My career as a corporate litigator was formidable, my reputation was ironclad, and my marriage to Sebastian was, I believed, the envy of our social circle. The private dining room was bathed in a warm, amber-hued glow that made the silver service shimmer like fallen stars against the white linen. Surrounding me were 30 of our closest friends and family, a mosaic of faces that represented 12 years of shared history. Across the table sat Isabella, my best friend of 15 years, looking radiant in an emerald silk slip dress that caught the candlelight with every graceful movement. I remember thinking, in a fleeting moment of misplaced gratitude, how lucky I was to have a sister of the soul who had meticulously planned every detail of this evening. Sebastian stood then, his tall frame cutting a sharp silhouette against the mahogany-paneled walls. He adjusted his silk tie, a habit he had when he was about to deliver a closing argument in court, and cleared his throat. I adjusted the strap of my black cocktail dress, a piece Isabella had insisted I buy, claiming it was the ultimate statement of timeless power, and leaned back, expecting the familiar, polished warmth of his annual birthday toast. But as he began to speak, the air in the room seemed to turn brittle. The usual affection in his eyes had been replaced by a clinical, almost detached coldness that made a visceral sting of apprehension vibrate through my chest. Before we celebrate another year of Jessica's life, Sebastian began, his voice projecting with an unfamiliar edge that silenced the soft murmur of the room, I need to share something of profound importance. We are all here because we value honesty, and I find that I can no longer live a life that is a performance. The room held its breath. I felt my mother's hand tighten on my shoulder from behind, her maternal instincts perhaps sensing the predator in the room long before I did. Sebastian's gaze did not land on me. Instead, it drifted toward the vintage wine cabinet where Isabella stood, her red lips curved into a subtle, terrifying arc of anticipation. It wasn't the smile of a friend, it was the smirk of a victor. The realization didn't hit me all at once, it arrived in agonizing, jagged pieces. I thought of the business trips to Zurich that always seemed to coincide with Isabella's wellness retreats. I remembered the new, musky cologne Sebastian had started wearing, the very scent Isabella had once recommended during one of our weekly coffee dates. The pieces clicked together with the deafening roar of a landslide. Jessica has been an incredible partner for 12 years, Sebastian continued, addressing the room as if I were a legacy project being phased out rather than his wife. But sometimes, love finds us in unexpected places, even when we try to deny it. Isabella and I have discovered a connection that neither of us can ignore any longer. We have decided to build a future together, starting tonight. The silence that followed was not the respectful quiet of a shocked audience, it was the suffocating, heavy silence of a champagne-soaked betrayal. I watched Isabella step forward, her emerald dress shimmering like a serpent's scales as she moved to stand by my husband's side. They didn't look like two people caught in a tragic mistake, they looked like a team. Someone at the back of the room gasped, and my sister Claire let out a sharp, choked sob, but it was the scattered, nervous laughter of a few acquaintances that truly cut deep. To them, this was a spectacle, a high society scandal to be dissected over brunch the following morning. My humiliation was their entertainment. I looked down at the sterling silver fork I had been fidgeting with. It felt heavy, cold, and utterly useless. For 15 years, I had shared my secrets, my fears, and my triumphs with Isabella. I had held her hand through her divorce and toasted to her success in real estate. And for 12 years, I had built a fortress of a life with Sebastian, believing our foundation was made of granite. To see them standing there, bathed in the glow of my birthday candles, was to watch the facade of my entire existence crumble into ash. Sebastian had the audacity to look me in the eye then. Emma, Jessica, he corrected himself, the slip of the tongue revealing the name he likely used for her in the dark. We didn't want to hurt you, but the heart wants what it wants. We hope that, in time, you can find it in yourself to be happy for us. I felt the heat of 1,000 eyes on me, waiting for the breakdown. They expected tears, a shrill scream of agony, perhaps a glass thrown in rage. But as the I of this story, as the woman who had spent decades mastering the art of the long game, I felt a sudden, icy clarity wash over me. The pain was there, a gaping wound in the center of my being, but it was shielded by a wall of absolute, frozen resolve. I stood slowly, the silk of my black dress whispering against my skin. I smoothed the fabric over my hips with deliberate care, my movements steady and measured. I looked at Isabella, noting the way her emerald dress contrasted with my morning black. How thoughtful of you, Isabella, I said, my voice projecting with a calm that seemed to unnerve them more than any scream could have. To insist I wear black tonight. You were dressing me for my own funeral, weren't you? Isabella's smile faltered for the briefest of seconds, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her polished features. Sebastian opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer some platitude about moving forward, but I raised a hand, silencing him instantly. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning. With a slow, rhythmic grace, I reached for my left wrist. I unclasped the diamond tennis bracelet Sebastian had given me for our 10th anniversary, a piece he had claimed symbolized our unbreakable bond. The diamonds caught the light, sparkling with a mocking brilliance. I held it up for a moment, letting the room see the weight of the history I was holding, and then I let it fall. It landed on the pristine white tablecloth with a dull, heavy thud, coming to rest right next to the untouched birthday cake. This story doesn't end the way you think it does, I said softly, my voice carrying the chill of a winter storm. You've orchestrated a beautiful humiliation, Sebastian. Truly. But you've forgotten one thing. You've spent 12 years watching me win in courtrooms by being 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Did you really think our marriage was the only place where I wasn't paying attention? I didn't wait for an answer. I picked up my clutch, looked at my father, who was vibrating with a protective rage, and gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. As I walked out of Lou Blanc, the heels of my shoes clicking against the hardwood floor like a countdown, I didn't look back. I could hear the murmur of conversations exploding behind me, the sound of my life becoming a headline. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped onto the sidewalk, and for the first time that evening, I allowed myself a real smile, not one of happiness, but one of predatory intent. They thought they had reached the climax of their grand romantic revelation. They thought they had written the ending to my story. They were wrong. As I watched the valet bring my car around, I felt the first threads of a new plan beginning to weave themselves together in the darkness of my mind. The glass had shattered, yes. But shattered glass is far more dangerous than a whole mirror. It is sharper, harder to track, and capable of drawing blood from those who dare to step on it. This wasn't my ending. This was the opening statement of the most important case of my life. The morning after my birthday did not arrive with the dramatic flair of a thunderstorm or the cinematic weight of a tragedy. It arrived with a cruel, mocking sunshine that spilled across the silk sheets of a bed that felt suddenly, violently cavernous. My phone, resting on the mahogany nightstand, was a vibrating hive of unwanted sympathy. Each notification, Thinking of you, from a sorority sister I hadn't spoken to in years, a frantic, please call me, from my mother, did you see the video, from a gossiping associate, was a digital breadcrumb leading back to the corpse of my reputation. I did not check them. To engage with their pity was to accept the role of the victim, and in the courtroom of my own mind, I was already preparing a far more aggressive stance. By noon, I had disabled every account, changed my SIM card, and effectively murdered the social persona of Jessica, the poised wife of a legal titan. I became a social ghost by choice, not by circumstance. The first step of my cold resolve was the physical extraction from the life I had built. I packed only the essentials, my most powerful laptop, a few changes of tailored clothing that favored utility over elegance, and a folder of documents I had the foresight to duplicate months ago when Sebastian first started coming home smelling of Isabella's signature sandalwood perfume. I didn't head to a 5-star hotel where the concierge would recognize me. Instead, I drove to a part of the city where the architecture was functional and the residents were too exhausted by their own lives to notice a woman in dark sunglasses. I rented a modest, one-bedroom apartment under the name Emma Vance, my mother's maiden name, paying 6 months in advance with a cashier's check from a private account Sebastian had forgotten existed. The apartment was a stark contrast to the sprawling penthouse overlooking the park. It smelled of industrial lemon cleaner and old radiator steam, and the view was of a brick alleyway and a distant, flickering neon sign for a laundromat. To anyone else, it would have been a descent into misery. To me, it was a sanctuary of calculating silence. There were no lilies here to remind me of my wedding day, no curated art pieces that Isabella had helped me select, and no echoes of Sebastian's practiced laughter. In this sparse, anonymous space, I could finally strip away the layers of the betrayed wife and reconnect with the woman I had been before I allowed my brilliance to be subsumed by his ambition, a corporate litigator who specialized in finding the structural rot in multi-million-dollar empires. I set up my workstation with surgical precision. My laptop was the only expensive thing in the room, a high-performance machine equipped with encrypted browsers and VPNs. I spent the first week in a state of hyper-focused immersion, tracing the digital breadcrumbs of their betrayal, which had left a far more permanent trail than they realized. Sebastian and Isabella were arrogant. They believed that because they were the golden couple of our circle, they were untouchable. They had underestimated the very thing that made me a partner at my firm, my ability to see the patterns in the noise. I didn't look for love letters or hotel receipts, those were the tools of a divorce lawyer. I looked for the money. Using my expertise in corporate law, I began to dissect Sebastian's firm. I knew the cadence of his billing cycles, the names of his silent partners, and the specific offshore accounts he used for tax optimization. I began to notice discrepancies, small at first, then glaring, that suggested he had been diverting firm resources to fund Isabella's recent real estate acquisitions. Isabella, for all her social grace, was a woman of voracious and undisciplined appetite. Her real estate empire was built on a foundation of high-interest leverage and questionable zoning favors. Through the calculating silence of my new life, I watched as her social media posts, full of staged joy and emerald green dresses, revealed the locations of her latest projects. Every tagged location was a lead, every photo of a groundbreaking ceremony was a clue to a potential building code violation or an undisclosed investor. The emotional toll was a dull, constant ache, but I funneled it into my research like fuel into an engine. There were moments, usually in the gray hours before dawn, when the silence of the apartment felt heavy enough to crush my lungs. I would see Isabella's face in my mind, the way she had looked at me for 15 years with a mask of sisterly devotion while she was systematically dismantling my home. I would remember Sebastian's hand on the small of my back at gala events, a gesture I once thought was protective but now realized was merely a way to keep me in his shadow. But then, I would look at the screen, at the spreadsheets and the legal filings, and the heat of my rage would crystallize back into cold resolve. I wasn't just planning a divorce, I was architecting a total professional and social annihilation. One evening, my sister Claire managed to track me down through a private investigator our father had hired. She pounded on the door of my sparse apartment, her voice thick with tears as she begged me to come home, to let the family support me. I stood on the other side of the wood, my hand hovering over the lock, but I didn't turn it. Pity would soften me. sympathy would blur the sharp edges of my intent. "I'm healing, Claire," I whispered to the closed door, though I knew she couldn't hear me through her sobs. "But I'm not coming back as the woman you knew." After she left, the silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. I sat back down at my desk. I had found something interesting in a series of SEC filings related to a development project Isabella had spearheaded 3 years ago. There was a name, a junior auditor who had been fired shortly after questioning a series of consultancy fees paid to an shell company owned by Sebastian. It was a thread. A small, frayed, seemingly insignificant thread. But I knew that if I pulled it with enough surgical precision, the entire tapestry of their lives would begin to unravel. I leaned back, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in my eyes. Sebastian and Isabella were currently at a charity auction, I knew, basking in the glow of their brave, new love. They thought they had escaped the wreckage of my birthday with nothing but a few ruffled feathers and some temporary gossip. They had no idea that I had become a ghost, and that ghosts are the most dangerous entities of all because they see everything and cannot be heard again. As I began to draft the first of many anonymous emails to the Securities and Exchange Commission, I felt a strange, chilling sense of peace. The art of disappearing was not about hiding, it was about positioning oneself for the strike. And I was now perfectly positioned. The modest apartment on the edge of the city had transitioned from a sanctuary of silence into a high-stakes war room. The industrial lemon scent had long since been replaced by the smell of cold coffee and the ozone tang of a laptop running at maximum capacity for 18 hours a day. As Emma Vance, I was a non-entity, a shadow in a bathrobe, but as Jessica, the architect of ruin, I was beginning to hold the threads of a dozen lives in my hands. The walls of the living room were no longer bare, they were covered in a complex tapestry of printed spreadsheets, organizational charts, and blurred photographs of people who thought they were safe in their luxury. I spent my nights staring at this web, tracing the invisible lines of greed and arrogance that connected my husband and my best friend to the very corporate vulnerabilities that would eventually entomb them. Isabella's real estate empire was the first to show its structural rot. To the public, she was a visionary, the woman who transformed forgotten neighborhoods into curated lifestyle hubs. But through the lens of meticulous documentation, her success looked less like vision and more like a sophisticated shell game. I spent 3 days cross-referencing her property acquisitions with a list of offshore holding companies I'd discovered buried in a dormant server at Sebastian's firm. The pattern was unmistakable. Isabella was using a network of Cayman-based entities to buy properties from herself at inflated prices, creating artificial losses to offset her massive domestic profits. It was a textbook case of tax evasion, hidden behind a veneer of philanthropic urban development. Every community garden she planted was funded by money that should have been in the public coffer. I felt a grim, cold satisfaction as I highlighted the discrepancies in neon yellow. Isabella didn't just want success, she wanted it for free, at the expense of the very society that applauded her. But the discovery that truly made my blood run cold involved Sebastian. I had always known he was ambitious, I had supported that ambition, fueled it with my own brilliance, but I had never suspected the sheer scale of his ethical breaches. While digging through the digital breadcrumbs of his consultancy fees, I found evidence that he had been double-dipping. He was representing major developers while simultaneously advising the very regulatory boards that approved their permits, using a shell company managed by Isabella to collect advisory fees from both sides. It was a staggering conflict of interest that would not only cost him his license but could lead to federal charges. My husband, the man whose integrity I had defended at 1,000 dinner parties, was nothing more than a high-priced middleman for corruption. The betrayal I felt at Lou Blanc was a sharp, localized pain. This discovery was a slow-acting poison, realizing that the man I loved was a stranger I had helped build. I realized then that I couldn't do this alone. To ensure their downfall was absolute, I needed to forge clandestine alliances with the very people they had trampled on their way to the top. I began by identifying their most formidable rivals, the people with the resources to amplify the damage once I provided the spark. My first target was Marcus Sterling, a ruthless real estate titan who had lost a major downtown contract to Isabella under suspicious circumstances 2 years ago. Under my Emma Vance persona, I reached out through an encrypted messaging app, offering him a gift of information. "Why are you doing this?" Sterling's voice had been wary during our first brief, voice-modulated call. "What's your angle?" "My angle is justice served with surgical precision, Mr. Sterling," I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "Isabella Monroe didn't beat you with a better bid, she beat you with a bribed zoning board. I have the bank records. I don't want your money, I want your reach. When I give the signal, I want you to be the one who demands the public inquiry." There was a long silence on the other end. "And what do you get out of it?" "The pleasure of watching a house of cards fall," I said, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a genuine spark of something resembling joy. I didn't stop with Sterling. I reached out to a former partner at Sebastian's firm who had been forced out after questioning the Swiss accounts. I contacted a disgruntled junior architect whose career Isabella had crushed to cover up a structural flaw in one of her buildings. Each of these people became a strand in my web, a clandestine ally who had every reason to want Sebastian and Isabella erased from the social and professional map. I was no longer just a woman seeking revenge, I was a conductor leading an orchestra of grievances, preparing for a crescendo that would shatter the windows of every penthouse in the city. The emotional weight of this double life was exhausting. I lived in a state of constant, vibrating tension. I would catch my reflection in the darkened window of the apartment and barely recognize the woman staring back. My eyes were sunken, my skin pale, and my expression had hardened into a permanent mask of calculation. Was this what it meant to be the architect of ruin? To become as cold and hollow as the people I was trying to destroy? Sometimes, I would find myself holding the diamond bracelet, the one I had retrieved from the restaurant table after the police had cleared the scene, and wonder if I was simply replacing one form of obsession with another. But then, I would remember the way Sebastian had looked at Isabella in the candlelight of my birthday, and the hollowness would be replaced by a renewed, searing focus. I spent my nights drafting the grand file, a master document of every ethical breach, every tax dodge, and every lie they had told. It was a work of meticulous documentation that would make any prosecutor weep with joy. I knew that once I released this, there would be no going back. The woman I had been, the Jessica who believed in the law, in marriage, in the fundamental goodness of her friends, would be gone forever. I was burning my old life to the ground to ensure that they had nowhere to hide in the ruins. As I sat in the calculating silence of my war room, watching the sunrise paint the alleyway in shades of bruised purple, I sent the final encrypted packet to Marcus Sterling. The first seeds of ruin were planted. Sebastian and Isabella were currently planning their engagement party, I had heard through the grapevine of my clandestine allies. They were picking out flowers, tasting menus, and basking in the thrill of their illicit victory. They had no idea that the very ground they stood on was being excavated, inch by inch, by the ghost they thought they had exorcised. I leaned back in my chair, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm. The web was complete. Now, I just had to wait for the first fly to land. The first domino didn't fall with a thunderous crash, it fell with the soft, clinical click of a send button at 3 o'clock in the morning. I sat in the blue light shadows of my war room, my finger lingering on the keys as the digital payloads, the culmination of weeks of meticulous documentation, streaked across the encrypted ether toward their destinations. One packet for the State Bar's Ethics Committee, one for the Internal Revenue Service, and the most volatile one for the city's chief building inspector. This was the commencement of my symphony of destruction, and as I watched the status bars turn from sending to delivered, I felt a chilling, profound sense of stillness. The time for research was over, the time for ruin had begun. I was no longer a victim waiting for the world to notice her pain, I was the unseen hand rewriting the destiny of a crumbling empire. By Tuesday morning, the scent of scandal began to waft through the city's high-altitude boardrooms. It started as a ripple at Sebastian's firm. I had utilized a series of strategic leaks to ensure that the firm's managing partners received, anonymous, tips regarding Sebastian's diversion of resources to Isabella's projects. I knew how the partners operated, they were men who valued discretion above all else, but they valued their own equity even more. When the State Bar's investigators arrived at 9 a.m. for a routine audit that was anything but routine, the firm's polished glass doors might as well have been the gates of a fortress under siege. From my laptop, I monitored the frantic internal emails, leaked to me by my clandestine ally, the former partner I had contacted, and I could almost smell the ozone of Sebastian's mounting panic. His assistants were being questioned, his hard drives were being mirrored, and the consultancy fees, that had once seemed like clever legal maneuvering, were now being scrutinized under the harsh, unyielding light of a forensic audit. Simultaneously, the strike against Isabella was more visceral, more public. I had provided the building department with the specific structural reports that Isabella had suppressed regarding her flagship luxury development, the Verdant Spires. At noon, while Isabella was likely hosting a lunch to celebrate her recent success, the news broke. City officials had issued an immediate, stop-work order and a mandatory evacuation of the partially occupied North Tower due to critical structural inconsistencies and unauthorized foundation modifications. The images on the local news were breathtaking in their brutality, yellow caution tape fluttering against the backdrop of Isabella's emerald-tinted glass, angry residents carrying boxes out of their million-dollar condos, and city inspectors looking grim as they pointed at the hollow foundations of her pride. The real estate queen's empire wasn't just under threat, it was being condemned in front of a live television audience. I chose to witness the fallout of the first domino in person, though I remained a shadow in the crowd. I drove to a nondescript cafe across the street from Le Blanc, the very restaurant where my life had been dismantled only weeks prior. I knew they would go there, it was their safe space, the stage for their victory, and now, inevitably, the bunker for their defeat. I sat by the window, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and dark glasses, sipping a bitter espresso that tasted like the truth. Around 1 p.m., Sebastian's silver Porsche screeched to a halt in the valet line. He emerged looking frantic, his tie loosened, his hair, usually a masterpiece of groomed perfection, wild and windblown. A moment later, Isabella arrived in her own car, her face a mask of pale, frozen terror. They didn't embrace with the grand, romantic passion they had displayed at my birthday, they stood on the sidewalk and argued, their gestures sharp and accusatory. Watching them through the glass, I felt a strange, detached curiosity. This was the love that was worth destroying a 15-year friendship and a 12-year marriage. This was the unbreakable connection they had boasted about. Beneath the scent of scandal, there was something much more pungent, the smell of mutual blame. Isabella was gesturing toward the news trucks parked near her development, her mouth moving in a silent scream of frustration, while Sebastian checked his phone incessantly, likely watching his professional reputation evaporate in real time. They were two predators who had suddenly realized they were being hunted, and in their panic, they were already beginning to turn on one another. The "we" they had used so arrogantly at my birthday party was already fracturing into a desperate, selfish "I." The social consequences followed with a speed that would have been dizzying if I hadn't orchestrated it myself. By mid-afternoon, the strategic leaks had reached the city's most influential gossip columnists. The story was no longer just about building codes or audits, it was about the morality of the mighty. The connection between the audit at Sebastian's firm and the violations at Isabella's towers was being whispered about in every country club and charity board. My clandestine alliances were working perfectly. Marcus Sterling had already released a public statement, expressing deep concern for the safety of the city's residents and calling for a full investigation into Isabella's entire portfolio. The society matrons who had once vied for an invitation to Isabella's galas were now deleting her number from their phones. They were social vultures, and they could smell the rot in the crumbling empire from miles away. As evening fell, I returned to my sparse apartment, the silence now feeling like a victory lap. I opened a bottle of wine, not the expensive vintage from Le Blanc, but a simple, sharp red, and watched the city lights flicker on. My phone, which I kept on a separate, secure line, buzzed with a message from my contact at the firm. Sebastian had been asked to take an immediate and indefinite leave of absence while the investigation proceeded. His office was being packed by interns. Isabella's primary lenders had frozen her credit lines, citing the material risk of the building violations. The first domino had hit the second, and the chain reaction was now self-sustaining. I looked at the grand file on my computer screen, the meticulous documentation that was still largely untapped. I had only pulled the smallest of threads, yet the entire tapestry was already beginning to fray. There was a part of me, a lingering, vestigial part of the old Jessica, that felt a pang of horror at the sheer scale of the destruction I had unleashed. I had spent my life building things, protecting reputations, upholding the law. Now, I was the one setting the fires. But then I remembered the clatter of my bracelet on the tablecloth. I remembered the way Isabella had looked at me while wearing that emerald dress, her eyes filled with a pity that was more insulting than her betrayal. I took a slow sip of wine and let the cold resolve settle back into my bones. The symphony of destruction had only just finished its first movement. The panic I had seen on their faces at the sidewalk was nothing compared to the absolute isolation that was coming. They had wanted a life without me, they were about to get exactly that, but in a world where no one else wanted them either. As I closed my laptop for the night, the blue light fading from my eyes, I realized that the hardest part of the long game wasn't the planning, it was the patience. I had to let the dominoes fall in their own time, ensuring that by the time the last one hit the floor, there would be nothing left for them to salvage. I lay down in the dark, the calculating silence of the room finally feeling like peace. High society is not a community, it is a predatory ecosystem, a garden of exquisite blooms that conceals a ruthless hunger for the weak and the wounded. I had spent 15 years cultivating my place in this world, understanding that status is a currency more volatile than any stock and far more difficult to earn back once spent. In the weeks following the first public hits on Sebastian's firm and Isabella's developments, I watched from my shadow-filled apartment as the environment I once called home began to digest them. They had committed the one sin that our circle never forgives, they had become tacky. It wasn't just the infidelity, in our world, affairs are often treated with a discreet, knowing nod. It was the public nature of the betrayal, the orchestrated humiliation of my 40th birthday at Lou Blanc, that had soured their brave new love into a poisonous reputation. I made sure the details were whispered with a precision that left no room for reinterpretation. Through my clandestine alliances and carefully placed confidences to society's most prolific gossips, I ensured that everyone knew Isabella had chosen the venue, the guest list, and even my dress, specifically to maximize the spectacle of my pain. I painted a picture of a calculated, sociopathic cruelty that made even the most hardened socialites shiver. To the social vultures who circled the upper echelons of the city, Sebastian and Isabella were no longer a power couple, they were a cautionary tale, a pair of pariahs whose presence threatened the curated peace of every dinner party and board meeting. I watched, invisible and omnipresent, as the systematic ostracization began to take hold like a slow-moving frost. The first real blow to their vanity came from the Lakeside Country Club. Sebastian had been a member for a decade, his identity deeply entwined with the prestige of his locker and his regular Saturday morning tea time with the city's judicial elite. I received a frantic, leaked voice memo from a contact at the club's reception. Sebastian had arrived for his usual round, only to find his membership under administrative review following the recent ethical audits. The sight of him standing in the lobby, dressed in his expensive golf attire, being told by a 20-year-old clerk that he was no longer welcome, was a victory I tasted in the back of my throat like vintage wine. He wasn't just losing his job, he was losing the rooms where he felt like a god. He was discovering the sting of isolation, a cold, sharp sensation that no amount of Isabella's reassurances could dull. Isabella's descent was even more public, and therefore more agonizing for a woman who lived for the camera's flash. The annual Silver Rose Gala, the crowning event of the social season, was her stage. She had been on the committee for 5 years, her name a permanent fixture on the heavy, cream-colored invitations. But this year, the committee, prompted by a series of anonymous tips I sent regarding the financial irregularities of her charity foundation, voted to revoke her membership. When she tried to call her sisters in the junior league, she found herself greeted by the digital wall of blocked numbers and unreturned voicemails. She had spent a decade building a network of best friends, only to realize they were merely mirrors reflecting her own reflected glory. Without the status, she was nothing to them but a ghost. I decided to attend the Silver Rose Gala myself, not as Jessica, the betrayed wife, but as a silent observer from the balcony of the grand ballroom, having secured a ticket through Marcus Sterling. I watched from the shadows as Sebastian and Isabella attempted a desperate, final stand. They arrived late, dressed in a defiant display of couture, he in a bespoke tuxedo, she in a gown of shimmering gold that seemed to scream for attention. They walked into the room with their heads held high, expecting the usual rush of greetings, the air kisses, the fawning attention of the social vultures. Instead, they were met with a wall of silence so profound it seemed to vibrate. As they moved through the crowd, a physical space opened up around them, a literal vacuum of ostracization. People who had been laughing a second before suddenly found something fascinating at the bottom of their glasses. Groups turned their backs with the synchronized grace of a school of fish avoiding a predator. I watched Sebastian's face turn a mottled, angry red as a judge he had known for 20 years walked right past him without a flicker of recognition. Isabella stood beside him, her golden dress suddenly looking like a costume, her eyes darting around the room in a frantic search for a friendly face that didn't exist. The sting of isolation was no longer a metaphor, it was a physical barrier they couldn't breach. They stayed for less than 20 minutes. I watched them exit the ballroom, their footsteps echoing on the marble floor in the sudden, temporary hush that followed their departure. As soon as the doors closed behind them, the room erupted back into conversation, the sound of 300 people collectively exhaling. They weren't just gone, they were erased. The poisonous reputation they had cultivated through their own arrogance had acted as a social solvent, dissolving every bond they thought was unbreakable. I returned to my sparse apartment that night, the glitter of the gala still clinging to my senses, but the quiet of the alleyway felt more meaningful. I sat at my desk and opened the file on Isabella's remaining assets. The social isolation was merely the prelude, the financial strangulation was the main event. By ensuring they were pariahs, I had cut off their ability to network, to find new investors, or to secure the legal defense they so desperately needed. They were now trapped in a bunker of their own making, with only each other for company. I realized then that the most exquisite part of revenge isn't the loud, explosive moments of ruin, it's the quiet, persistent realization of what has been lost. Sebastian and Isabella had traded a world of respect, history, and loyalty for a momentary thrill, and now they were discovering that the thrill couldn't keep them warm in the cold vacuum of the social void. As I stared at the grand file, I felt a sense of clinical satisfaction. I had turned them into ghosts while they were still breathing. I had made them invisible in the very rooms where they had once thought themselves invincible. The symphony of destruction was moving into its middle movement. The first domino had fallen, the empire was crumbling, and now the isolation was setting in, rotting the foundation of their relationship from the inside out. I knew that soon, the mutual blame I had witnessed at the sidewalk would become a permanent feature of their lives. When the world turns its back on you, the only person left to scream at is the one standing next to you. I leaned back, closing my eyes, and listened to the silence of the city. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The morning of the exposé arrived with the quiet, chilling precision of a guillotine blade. I did not need an alarm clock, the internal rhythm of my revenge had me awake at 4 a.m., sitting in the dark with a cup of black coffee that had gone cold hours ago. I watched the digital clock on my laptop flip to 5 a.m., the exact moment the Metropolitan Business Journal released its online edition. For months, I had been the ghostwriter of this tragedy, feeding the investigative team, the grand file, in anonymous, untraceable increments. I had provided the smoking gun, the ledger that linked Sebastian's diverted client funds to Isabella's offshore shell companies. Now, I sat back to watch the world read the story I had meticulously curated. The headline was a masterpiece of professional annihilation, gilded greed, the corrupt architecture of the Sterling Monroe Empire. As I scrolled through the 10,000-word piece, I felt a detached sense of awe at the thoroughness of the destruction. The article didn't just hint at impropriety, it laid out the evidence with the clinical coldness of an autopsy. There were the scanned copies of the consultancy contracts I had leaked, the testimony from the disgruntled junior architect I had coached, and the forensic analysis of the structural failures in the verdant spires. Every paragraph was a nail in the coffin of their public disgrace. The journalist had even managed to interview a former client of Sebastian's, a widow whose settlement had been delayed, while her money was being used to bridge a gap in Isabella's latest acquisition. That detail was the indelible stain, the one that moved the story from a dry business scandal to a narrative of heartless villainy. By 9 a.m., the physical reality of the exposé began to manifest. I drove to the financial district, parking my nondescript sedan 3 blocks away from Sebastian's firm. I wanted to see the erasure with my own eyes. As I walked toward the towering glass monolith of Vance, Sterling and Associates, a firm that had once carried my own maiden name and its legacy, I saw the maintenance crew already at work. A man on a ladder was carefully peeling the gold leaf letters of Sebastian's name from the directory in the lobby. It was a silent, ritualistic removal. By noon, his name would be stripped from the letterhead, the website, and the very glass of his corner office. The partners had moved with the speed of men trying to amputate a gangrenous limb before it killed the body. Sebastian wasn't just fired, he was being unmade. This was professional annihilation in its purest form, a total excision of a man's 12-year legacy in a matter of hours. I found a bench in the park across the street, a vantage point from which I could see the chaos. Within an hour, Sebastian emerged from the building, carrying a single cardboard box. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, his expensive suit hanging loosely on a frame that seemed to have aged a decade overnight. He stood on the sidewalk, his eyes scanning the street for a car that wasn't coming. His personal driver had likely been the first perk to be revoked. I watched as he attempted to hail a taxi, but the drivers, perhaps sensing the aura of public disgrace that now clung to him like a shroud, seemed to pass him by. He was a man who had built his life on being the most important person in every room, and now he was a ghost on his own doorstep. The blow to Isabella was swifter and, if possible, more final. While Sebastian was being stripped of his office, Isabella was appearing before an emergency hearing of the State Real Estate Commission. I tuned into the live audio feed from my phone. The chairperson's voice was devoid of emotion as she read the findings. The evidence of tax evasion, combined with the willful endangerment of public safety regarding the structural compromises at the Verdant Spires, left the board with no choice. Her real estate license was revoked, effective immediately. Furthermore, the commission was referring the case to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. I closed the audio app, the silence of the park returning to fill my ears. Isabella, the woman who had once prided herself on being the queen of the skyline, was now legally forbidden from even selling a studio apartment. She had lost her identity, her livelihood, and the very foundation of her social standing. The smoking gun I had provided hadn't just ended her career, it had turned her into a felon in the eyes of the law. The emerald dresses and the charity galas were now relics of a dead era. As I sat there, watching the midday sun reflect off the buildings Isabella would never own and the firm Sebastian would never lead, I felt the first real weight of what I had done. I had sought a masterclass in betrayal and rebirth, but I was realizing that rebirth requires a total death of the former self. To destroy them so completely, I had to use the very tools they had taught me, the manipulation of truth, the exploitation of weakness, and the cold calculation of the long game. There was an indelible stain on my own soul now, a darkness that came from knowing exactly how to ruin a human life. I saw a news crew approaching Sebastian on the sidewalk, their cameras shoved into his face as he tried to shield himself with his cardboard box. The public disgrace was now a 24-hour news cycle. He looked toward the park, his eyes landing on the bench where I sat, but he didn't see me. I was just a woman in a hat, another stranger witnessing his fall. He looked away, his shoulders slumped in a gesture of absolute defeat. The legal walls were closing in. I knew that by the end of the week, the SEC would be knocking on their doors, and the civil lawsuits from the residents of the Verdant Spires would begin to pile up like a winter storm. They had nothing left, no money, no status, no allies. They only had each other, and as I remembered the way they had looked at one another during their argument on the sidewalk, I knew that even that love wouldn't survive the pressure of the coming collapse. I stood up, smoothing my coat, and walked back to my car. The sixth movement of my symphony was complete. The professional annihilation was total. I had taken away the things they loved more than they had ever loved me, their power and their names. As I drove away from the wreckage of their lives, I realized that I wasn't waiting for them to apologize anymore. I was waiting for them to realize that the person who had destroyed them was the only person who had ever truly known them. And that, perhaps, was the most visceral sting of all. It is a profound irony of the human condition that betrayal, while capable of binding two people in a feverish, illicit heat, is a remarkably poor foundation for the cold reality of ruin. For months, Sebastian and Isabella had lived in the intoxicating high of their shared secret, a romance fueled by the adrenaline of deception and the vanity of thinking they were the protagonists of a grand, tragic epic. They believed their connection was a force of nature, a true love that justified the scorched earth they left in their wake. But as the professional annihilation settled into the marrow of their lives, that heat didn't just cool, it turned into a corrosive acid. I watched from the periphery of their collapsing world as the toxic remnants of their affair began to dissolve the very bond they had sacrificed everything to build. Without the cushioning of wealth and the ego-inflating mirrors of high society, they were forced to see each other for exactly what they were, two frightened, selfish individuals who had mistaken a hollow core of lust for a soul-deep connection. The first public fracture occurred outside the very courthouse where Isabella had just been served with a massive class-action lawsuit from the residents of the Verdant Spires. I was parked across the street, shielded by the tint of a rental car, witnessing the death of their unbreakable bond. They weren't the polished, untouchable couple of Louis Blanc anymore. Sebastian's suit was wrinkled, the fabric losing its crispness just like his authority, and Isabella's gold dress had been replaced by a somber gray wool coat that looked heavy with the weight of her anxiety. As they stepped onto the sidewalk, the argument erupted with a violence that drew the attention of every passerby with a smartphone. "You said you had the zoning handled, Isabella." Sebastian's voice, once a smooth baritone used to charm juries, was now a shrill rasp of mutual resentment. "You told me the foundation reports were a formality. I risked my firm's reputation, my father's legacy, on your incompetence." Isabella didn't cower. She turned on him with the ferocity of a cornered animal, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated vitriol. "My incompetence? You're the lawyer, Sebastian. You're the one who drafted the shell companies. You're the one who promised me we were invisible. If you hadn't been so obsessed with showing Jessica up at that stupid party, we wouldn't be under a federal microscope right now." "I wanted to be with you," he bellowed, oblivious to the small crowd forming around them. "I gave up a 12-year marriage for this nightmare." "No," Isabella spat, her voice dripping with the toxic remnants of their fractured romance. "You gave up Jessica because you were bored, and you chose me because I was a trophy you could use to feel young. Well, look at your trophy now, Sebastian. It's tarnished, and it's going to prison, and I'm taking you with me." Watching them, I felt a chilling sense of vindication. Their love had been a construction of shallow convenience, a parasite that fed on the stability I had provided for them. I had been the silent architect of the world they lived in. I had managed the house, the finances, the social schedules, and the emotional labor that allowed Sebastian to play the part of the successful man and Isabella to play the part of the glamorous muse. Without me to serve as the common enemy and the stable ground, they had nothing to hold on to but the wreckage of their own choices. The true love they had boasted of was revealed as nothing more than a shared delusion, a way to dress up their greed as something noble. The humiliating public arguments became a weekly occurrence, a grotesque reality show for the very people who had once envied them. They were seen screaming at each other in the aisles of a discount grocery store, a far cry from the organic markets and private chefs of their former life. They were caught on camera at a gas station, Sebastian refusing to pay for Isabella's coffee, their faces twisted in a symphony of mutual resentment. Each argument was a public autopsy of their affair, revealing the ugly truths they had hidden even from themselves. It wasn't just that they didn't love each other, it was that they had begun to loathe the sight of the person who reminded them of everything they had lost. I realized then that lust is a fire that requires constant oxygen, the oxygen of luxury, of secrecy, of being better than everyone else. When that oxygen is cut off by the stifling weight of debt and disgrace, the fire doesn't just go out, it suffocates the people trapped in the room with it. Sebastian looked at Isabella and saw the woman who had cost him his name. Isabella looked at Sebastian and saw the man who was no longer powerful enough to protect her. The hollow core of lust had been filled with the leaden weight of regret. By the end of the month, they were no longer living together. Isabella had retreated to a cramped apartment her cousin owned, while Sebastian was rumored to be sleeping on a pull-out sofa in his brother's study, his presence a source of shame for a family that had spent generations building a reputation he had dismantled in a single night. The final implosion happened via a leaked email exchange that made its way into the local tabloids, another gift I had facilitated through my network. "I hate you for what you turned me into," Isabella had written. "I wish I had never walked into that restaurant on her birthday. I wish I had never met you." Sebastian's reply was even more brutal. "You didn't need me to turn you into anything, Isabella. You were always a predator. I was just the fool who let you into the house." The tragedy of their situation was that they were both right. They had brought out the worst in each other, and now that the worst was all that remained, they couldn't bear to look at the reflection. Their romance hadn't been a tragedy, it had been a farce, a hollow performance that collapsed the moment the audience stopped clapping. I sat in my apartment, the grand file now almost entirely public, and felt a strange, quiet peace. I had expected to feel a surge of triumph at the sight of their breakup, but instead, I felt a profound sense of closure. I had set out to show them the true cost of their betrayal, but they were doing the work for me now. They were realizing that the most painful part of their ruin wasn't the loss of the money or the status, it was the realization that the person they had destroyed their lives for was someone they didn't even like. The implosion was complete. The we that had stood so defiantly at Lou Blanc was now two separate, broken entities, drifting apart in a sea of litigation and loathing. The seventh movement of my symphony had reached its final note. I had taken away their world, and in doing so, I had forced them to see the emptiness of their hearts. As I turned off the news, the silence of my room felt like a clean, sharp blade. I was no longer the betrayed wife, I was the woman who had watched a false god fall and realized he was made of nothing but straw. The silence of the penthouse was no longer the oppressive, hollow void it had been on the night I left. It was now a deliberate, curated stillness, a silence of victory. I had repurchased the property through a blind trust 3 weeks ago, reclaiming the high ground of my life with a check that represented the literal liquidation of Isabella's remaining assets. Standing in the center of the expansive living room, bathed in the cool, silver light of the moon reflecting off the city's skyline, I felt like a sovereign returning to a reclaimed kingdom. The furniture had been replaced, the curated art Isabella had suggested was gone, replaced by pieces that spoke of endurance and sharp edges. I was no longer a guest in my own life. I was the master of it. The knock came at precisely 11:47 p.m. It wasn't the sharp, authoritative rap of a man who owned the world, but a hesitant, scraping sound, the sound of someone who wasn't sure they had the right to exist on the other side of the door. I walked to the security monitor, my silk robe whispering against the hardwood floors. On the screen, the man standing in the hallway was a stranger. Sebastian looked like a blurred carbon copy of his former self, a ghost of a man whose vibrant, arrogant energy had been bled out by a month of public flaying. His designer stubble had grown into a ragged, unkempt beard, and his eyes were hollowed out by a dark, bruising fatigue. He was wearing a wrinkled department store coat that fit him poorly, a jarring sight for a man who had once treated bespoke tailoring as a secondary religion. I let him wait for exactly 5 minutes, 1 minute for every year he and Isabella had spent secretly eroding the foundation of my life. When I finally opened the door, the scent of him hit me first, a stale mixture of cheap cigarettes, desperation, and the cold, damp air of the streets. He looked up, and for a second, I saw the flicker of the old Sebastian, the part of him that expected me to soften, to gasp, to pull him into the warmth. But as his gaze met mine, that flicker died. He found no pity in my eyes, only the clinical observation of a scientist looking at a failed experiment. "Emma," he croaked, his voice a jagged remnant of the baritone that once charmed juries. He used the name he had slipped on at the restaurant, the name he had whispered in the dark to another woman. The irony was a visceral sting he seemed too broken to notice. "Please." I didn't know where else to go. "This is a private residence, Sebastian," I said, my voice as level and cold as the marble foyer behind me. "The concierge shouldn't have let a midnight beggar up to the penthouse." "I told them I still lived here," he whispered, his hands trembling as he reached out toward the doorframe. "I forgot. I don't." "You forgot many things," I replied. "Including the fact that I don't owe you a single minute of my time." "What do you want?" He stepped forward, a wave of ragged desperation rolling off him. Isabella is gone. She left for Dubai yesterday. Some cousin offered her a job as a secretary. She didn't even say goodbye, Emma. She took what was left and vanished. I'm alone. I have no firm, no license, no money. My brother won't return my calls. My father told me I'm a stain on the family name. He began to shake, a sob racking his thin frame. I'm so sorry. The apologies, they're hollow, I know they are, but God, I am so sorry. We made a mistake. We fell in love and we lost our minds. Please, Jessica. Just let me sit down. Just for an hour. I stepped back, not to invite him in, but to maintain the distance between my rebirth and his decay. He took it as an invitation anyway, stumbling into the living room. He looked around, his eyes widening as he realized the space had been purged of him. Every photo, every book, every trace of his 12-year residency had been incinerated or donated. He sank into a leather armchair, the only piece of furniture that remained from our time together, kept only as a grim trophy, and buried his face in his hands. Listening to his hollow apologies was like listening to a recording of a language I no longer spoke. He talked about moments of weakness, about how Isabella had manipulated the birthday announcement, about how he had been confused by the midlife pressure of his career. It was a pathetic litany of excuses, a desperate attempt to rewrite a story that had already been published in the national news. He looked up at me, his eyes brimming with tears that I knew were shed for himself, not for me. I miss us, he sobbed. I miss the way we were. I miss the house, the dinners, the way you always knew exactly what to say to make me feel invincible. I miss my wife. I miss you, Jessica. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, the city lights framing me like a halo of cold fire. I looked at him, this broken, unkempt creature who had once been the center of my universe, and felt a profound, chilling sense of clarity. The man in the chair wasn't mourning the loss of my heart, he was mourning the loss of his pedestal. You don't miss me, Sebastian, I said, the words falling through the air with the finality of a gavel. You just miss the life I gave you. He froze, his mouth hanging open in a silent protest. I was the architect of your invincibility, I continued, my voice gaining a predatory edge. I was the one who edited your closing arguments. I was the one who managed the partners' egos so you could stay in the spotlight. I was the one who curated our social standing so that you were always the guest of honor. You didn't love me, you loved the version of yourself that only existed because I allowed it. You were a creature of my creation, and the moment you stepped out of my light, you began to wither. You don't miss us. You miss the luxury, the respect, and the comfort that my labor provided for you. That's not true, he whispered, though the way he shrunk into the chair told a different story. I loved you. Love doesn't orchestrate a public execution on a woman's 40th birthday, I replied, moving toward the door and opening it wide. Love doesn't conspire with a best friend to strip a person of their dignity. What you feel now isn't love, Sebastian. It's the cold realization that the woman you thought was your doormat was actually the only thing keeping the roof over your head. You have caused irrevocable damage, not to me, as it turns out, but to yourself. I have reborn myself from the ashes of your betrayal. You are simply the ashes. He stood up slowly, his legs shaky. He looked at the door, then back at me, searching for even a sliver of the woman who used to forgive him for everything. He found nothing. I was no longer the wife who smoothed his path, I was the storm that had washed it away. Where am I supposed to go? He asked, a final, pitiful plea. That is the first decision you've had to make without me in 12 years, I said. I suggest you make it a good one. As he shuffled past me into the hallway, his shoulders slumped in the ultimate gesture of defeat, I felt the final chord of our history snap. I closed the door and turned the deadbolt, the metallic click echoing through the penthouse like a period at the end of a long, painful sentence. I walked back to the window and looked out at the city. Sebastian was down there now, a tiny, insignificant shadow lost in the grid of millions. He was the ghost of a man, wandering a world that no longer recognized his name. I picked up my glass of water, the liquid clear and cold, and took a sip. The midnight beggar was gone. The penthouse was silent. And for the first time in 40 years, I realized that the life I had given him was nothing compared to the life I was finally giving myself. The silence that followed Sebastian's departure was not the triumphant crescendo I had anticipated. For months, I had imagined this specific moment, the final, pathetic collapse of the man who had shattered my world, as the ultimate emotional catharsis, the cleansing fire that would finally burn away the lingering toxins of his betrayal. I had expected to feel a surge of divine justice, a warmth in my chest that whispered, "It is finished." Instead, as I stood in the foyer of my reclaimed penthouse, the only thing I felt was the biting chill of a draft I couldn't locate. The war was over. I had won every battle, reclaimed every territory, and decimated every enemy. But as I looked at my reflection in the darkened glass of the balcony door, I was struck by a terrifying thought. In the process of destroying the monsters, I had forgotten to check if I had become one myself. The next morning, the penthouse felt less like a palace and more like a museum of my own design, beautiful, expensive, and utterly devoid of life. I spent hours sitting at my desk, staring at the grand file, which was now nothing more than a collection of digital ghosts. The folders that once throbbed with the electricity of my rage were now static, their contents having done their work. I had achieved what few ever do, a total, unmitigated victory. Sebastian was a social and professional corpse, Isabella was an exile in a foreign land, stripped of her pride and her crown. Yet, as I surveyed the wreckage of their lives, I realized I was standing in the center of an internal wasteland. The vibrant, perhaps slightly naive woman who had walked into Lou Blanc on her 40th birthday was gone, and I wasn't sure if the architect who had replaced her knew how to do anything other than calculate. My sister, Claire, arrived around noon. She didn't call first, she simply showed up with 2 cups of coffee and a look of profound, quiet concern that I found increasingly difficult to meet. She walked through the living room, her eyes lingering on the bare walls where the war maps of my revenge had once hung. She sat on the edge of the sofa, the same sofa where I had once cried myself to sleep, and watched me as I stood by the window, my back to the world. "He came here, didn't he?" she asked softly. "I saw the reports. I saw him leaving the building last night. He looked like a ghost, Jessica. He looked like exactly what he deserved to be," I replied, my voice sounding distant even to my own ears. "He came to beg for a life that no longer exists. He wanted the comfort I used to provide, not the woman I've become." Claire sighed, a sound of heavy, maternal disappointment. "And are you happy? Now that the stage is empty and the actors are all broken? Do you feel the peace you promised yourself?" I turned to look at her, and for a moment, the mask of cold resolve slipped. "I feel empty, Claire. I feel like I've spent a year holding my breath, and now that I can finally breathe, the air tastes like ash. I look at what I've done, the surgical precision of it, the way I manipulated every social thread and legal loophole, and I realize I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the power of the strike. I enjoyed watching them realize it was me. But looking in the mirror of vengeance, I don't see my own face anymore. I see Isabella's coldness. I see Sebastian's capacity for calculation. I've spent so much time dissecting their flaws that I've grafted them onto my own soul. It's a Pyrrhic victory, isn't it?" Claire said, her voice dripping with a sadness that cut through my defenses. "You won the penthouse. You won the firm's respect. You won the social war. But you've turned your heart into a fortress, Jessica. You've become a destroyer. And destroyers don't know how to live in the houses they build, they only know how to watch them burn." I walked over to the chair Sebastian had occupied the night before. I could still see the faint indentation in the leather, a ghost of his presence. I had to become this, Claire. If I hadn't, they would have walked away with everything. They would have lived their brave new love on the bones of my reputation. I had to show them that actions have consequences. I had to be the one to hold the mirror up to their faces. "But who is holding the mirror up to yours?" Claire challenged, her eyes searching mine. You've spent a year in an internal wasteland, fueled by a rage that was justified, but rage is a hungry fire. It doesn't just eat the people you hate, it eats you, too. You've mastered the art of professional and social annihilation, but have you forgotten how to be a friend? Have you forgotten how to trust someone without looking for their hidden agenda? Her words were a visceral sting, sharper than any betrayal Sebastian had offered. I realized she was right. I had become so attuned to the digital breadcrumbs of deception that I saw a potential betrayal in every smile. I had forged clandestine alliances based on mutual greed and resentment, and in doing so, I had forgotten what a genuine connection felt like. I had achieved the ultimate emotional catharsis through destruction, but the relief was temporary. It was the high of the strike, followed by the low of the realization that the target was now gone, leaving me with a weapon I didn't know how to put down. I'm afraid, Claire, I whispered, the admission tearing at my throat. I'm afraid that I've hardened my heart so much to survive the fire that it's turned to stone. I look at the future and I don't see a life, I see a series of strategic maneuvers. I don't know how to go back to being the woman who believed in forever or best friends. I've seen the rot beneath the floorboards of everyone I know. How am I supposed to live in a world where I know exactly how easy it is to ruin someone? Claire stood up and pulled me into a hug. It was the first time in months I had allowed myself to be touched without bracing for an impact. You don't go back, Jessica. That woman is gone. But being a destroyer doesn't have to be your final form. You've proven you can dismantle a world. Now, the hardest case you'll ever have to argue is the one for your own humanity. You have to decide if you're going to spend the rest of your life guarding the ruins, or if you're going to use that brilliance to build something that isn't about them. After she left, the penthouse returned to its static, museum-like state. I sat on the balcony, watching the sunset bleed across the city. The victory was indeed Pyrrhic. I had the crown, but the kingdom was empty. I thought about the grand file one last time. It had been my Bible for a year, my source of strength and my map to the end. I reached for my laptop, my fingers hovering over the delete key. For the first time since my birthday, I felt a different kind of fear, the fear of the blank page. If I wasn't the woman who was destroying Sebastian and Isabella, who was I? If the vendetta was over, what was left of Jessica? I realized then that the true cost of revenge wasn't what I had taken from them, it was what I had allowed them to take from me, my capacity for uncomplicated joy. I had allowed their betrayal to define my identity for a year, turning myself into a mirror of their own darkness. As the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, I didn't press delete. Not yet. But I did close the laptop. I walked into the kitchen and poured a glass of water, not wine. I stood in the silence, listening to the city hum, and for the first time, I didn't look for the patterns in the noise. I just listened. The internal wasteland was still there, vast and gray, but in the corner of my mind, a small, stubborn thought took root. Destruction is easy. Creation is the real long game. And if I was as brilliant as I believed I was, it was time to prove it by building a life that had absolutely nothing to do with the people who had tried to break me. The transition from destruction to creation did not begin with a fanfare, but with the quiet, clinical deletion of a digital empire. On a Tuesday morning that felt unusually clear, I sat in my penthouse and finally dragged the grand file into the trash. The sound of the digital shredder was the only eulogy the past year received. I watched the progress bar slide toward completion, and as the file vanished, I felt a strange, buoyant lightness in my chest, a sensation of rising from the ashes of a woman I no longer wished to be. I had dismantled the lives of those who betrayed me with the precision of a surgeon, but I was beginning to realize that a surgeon who only knows how to amputate is a limited healer. If I were to truly reclaim my soul, I needed to discover if my brilliance could be used for architectural healing rather than just professional demolition. It was during this period of fragile, internal recalibration that I received an invitation for coffee from David Anderson. David was a name whispered with reverence in the upper echelons of the financial world, a venture capitalist known for his vulture reputation, though he preferred the term corporate resurrectionist. He was a man who didn't invest in trends, he invested in foundations. We met at a high-altitude boardroom in a building made of glass and steel, a space that felt miles away from the mahogany-heavy shadows of Sebastian's old world. David sat across from me, his expression unreadable, his eyes possessing a depth of observation that made me feel as though I were being audited by a master. "I've been watching you, Jessica," he began, skipping the pleasantries that usually lubricate these types of meetings. "The way you handled the Sterling Monroe situation was, frankly, a masterclass in market correction. Most people saw a social scandal. I saw someone who identified a systemic rot in two major assets and liquidated them with surgical precision. Your maneuvers weren't just about revenge, they were a display of extraordinary strategic brilliance." I felt the familiar, cold armor of my destroyer persona begin to settle over me, but I pushed it back. "If you've brought me here to talk about my vendetta, David, I'm afraid you're late to the show. That chapter is closed." "I don't care about the drama," David said, leaning forward, his voice dropping into a register of intense focus. "I care about the skill. You have an uncanny ability to see the structural weaknesses in an organization before the board even knows they exist. You can track patterns through 1,000 layers of noise. Up until now, you've used that transformative power to tear things down. I want to know if you have the visionary leadership to use it to build something back up." He pushed a thick, physical folder across the table. It was the antithesis of my grand file. Instead of evidence for a prosecution, it was a diagnostic report for a struggling heritage textile firm on the verge of bankruptcy, a company with a 100-year history and 500 employees whose lives were currently hanging by a thread of mismanagement and outdated technology. "This company is a ruin," David continued. "But its bones are good. It needs someone who can cut through the sentimentality, identify the rot, and perform a series of high-stakes interventions to save it. It needs architectural healing. I'm offering you the position of Chief Restructuring Officer for my firm's turnaround portfolio. You've proven you can destroy an empire in a year. I want to see if you can save one." The offer was a visceral shock to my system. For a year, I had been the ghost in the machine, the unseen hand of ruin. The idea of stepping into the light, not as a victim, and not as a vigilante, but as a leader, felt like stepping onto a tightrope without a net. Could I look at a failing business and see something other than a target? Could I look at a group of people and see something other than potential clandestine allies or social vultures? "Why me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Because rising from the ashes gives you a perspective that people who have never burned can't understand," David replied. "You know the cost of failure. You know the anatomy of betrayal. That makes you more dangerous, yes, but it also makes you more capable of true transformation. You've spent enough time in the wasteland, Jessica. It's time to see what you can grow." I didn't answer him immediately. I went back to my penthouse and spent the night looking at the city. From this height, the skyline looked like a living organism, a constant cycle of decay and renewal. I thought about the families of those 500 employees. I thought about the woman I had been, the one who protected the law, and the woman I was now, the one who knew how to bend it. I realized that my revenge had been a closed loop, a finite exercise in pain. But this? This was the opportunity for an infinite game. This was the pivot to grace. The next morning, I walked into the offices of the failing textile firm. It was a place of dusty looms and weary faces, a landscape of quiet despair. But as I walked through the factory floor, I didn't see a ruin. I saw potential. I saw the architectural healing that was required, the need to strip away the layers of bloated management, to update the technology, and to restore the pride of the craftsman. I felt the old electricity of my strategic mind clicking into place, but the current was different. It wasn't the searing heat of rage, it was the steady, luminous glow of purpose. I began the process with the same meticulous documentation I had used to ruin Sebastian, but my goals were the opposite. I identified the honest workers who had been sidelined by favoritism. I found the hidden efficiencies that had been buried under decades of bureaucracy. I stood before the board, men who initially looked at my poisonous reputation with skepticism, and I spoke with a visionary leadership that silenced their doubts. I didn't hide my past, I used it as evidence of my capability. I told them that I knew exactly how things fall apart, which made me the only person in the room who knew how to hold them together. Weeks turned into months, and the firm began to breathe again. The transformative power I had once used to leak documents was now being used to secure sustainable contracts. The surgical precision I had once used to isolate Isabella was now being used to cut costs without cutting people. For the first time in my life, I wasn't just working for a paycheck or for a husband's legacy, I was working for a future I was creating with my own hands. One evening, as I stood in the renovated showroom of the firm, looking at the first rolls of high-tech, sustainable fabric coming off the new looms, I realized that Claire had been right. Destruction was a fire that consumed the architect, but creation was a light that reflected back on her. I wasn't the woman I was at Lou Blanc, and I wasn't the ghost of the apartment. I was something new altogether, a woman rising from the ashes, not as a scorched remnant, but as a forged blade. David Anderson visited the site later that week. He looked at the bustling floor, then at me, a small, knowing smile on his face. "Architectural healing suits you, Jessica," he said. "It's harder than destruction," I admitted, looking out at the workers who now walked with their heads a little higher. "But the view is better." The pivot to grace was not a single moment, but a daily choice. I still had the capacity for coldness, the ability to see the strike, but I chose to use it as a shield for those under my leadership rather than a sword for my own vendetta. As I walked out of the factory that day, the cool air felt like a benediction. My story was no longer about what had been taken from me, it was about what I was giving back. The long game had changed, and for the first time in 41 years, I was finally winning for the right reasons. The morning air in my new office, perched high above the revitalized textile district, carried a scent that was fundamentally different from the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the penthouse. It smelled of ozone from the new machinery downstairs, of fresh parchment, and of the bracing, salt-tinged wind that swept in from the harbor. It was the scent of a life in motion, a life defined by the rhythmic thrum of productivity rather than the static, frozen tension of a vendetta. I sat at my desk, a sleek slab of reclaimed oak that bore the marks of its previous struggles, and looked at the small pile of physical mail that my assistant had placed in the center of the blotter. In a world of instantaneous digital noise, physical envelopes possessed a certain gravity, a weight that demanded a slower, more deliberate kind of attention. 2 envelopes sat apart from the invoices and trade journals. The first was a standard, utilitarian business envelope, postmarked from a zip code that had once been beneath Sebastian's notice, a neighborhood of cracked sidewalks and weary brickwork where the law was a shield for the desperate rather than a sword for the powerful. The second was smaller, made of thin, airmail paper that felt brittle beneath my touch, postmarked from Dubai. I stared at them for a long time, the echoes of regret already beginning to vibrate in the silence of the room. I didn't feel the sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline that had once accompanied any news of my enemies. Instead, I felt a profound, heavy sense of detachment, as if I were looking at artifacts from a civilization that had long since vanished beneath the waves. I opened Sebastian's letter first. The stationery was cheap, the logo of the Community Legal Aid Clinic printed in a faded, utilitarian blue. His handwriting, once a flourishing, arrogant script that filled the margins of my life with his demands, had become cramped and hesitant. It was a letter of unsolicited atonement, a formal apology that read like a legal confession. "Jessica," it began, no longer using the slip of the tongue, "Emma," that had once been my greatest insult. "I am writing this from a desk that is smaller than your walk-in closet used to be. I spend my days representing tenants facing eviction and fathers trying to see their children, the very people I used to call liabilities, in my old life. There is no mahogany here, no vintage scotch, and certainly no prestige. But for the first time in my life, I am seeing the law for what it is, a fragile thread that holds a person's world together. I realize now that I was the one who cut your thread. I orchestrated a humiliation that I thought was a climax, only to realize it was the end of my own humanity. I am not asking for your forgiveness, I know that is a weight I have no right to place on you, but I needed you to know that I understand the price of what I did. I am living in the ruins of the man I was, trying to build something that isn't a lie." I set the letter down, feeling the weight of forgiveness as a physical sensation, not a desire to grant it, but a realization that I no longer needed to withhold it. Sebastian was seeking redemption in the grit and the grime of the real world, far from the polished mirrors of our shared past. He was no longer the titan I had dismantled, he was a man performing the slow, agonizing labor of structural repair on his own soul. The echoes of regret in his words were genuine, but they arrived at a shore that had long since been reshaped by different tides. He was a part of my history, a chapter written in ink that had finally dried. The second letter, from Isabella, was shorter and carried a different kind of sting. The paper was nearly transparent, as if it were trying to disappear even as I read it. Jessica, I saw the news about the textile firm. You always were the better strategist. I'm living in a studio apartment in a part of the city where the luxury towers are just a shimmer on the horizon. I work as a secretary for a man who doesn't know my name and couldn't care less about my vision. I spend my nights looking at the desert and remembering the way we used to laugh over coffee before I decided that I wanted your life more than I wanted your friendship. I have lost everything, my name, my pride, and the woman who was the only sister I ever had. I hope you're happy in the world you've built. I'm just trying to learn how to be invisible. Isabella's words were a stark contrast to Sebastian's. Where he sought atonement through action, she was drowning in the static of her own loss. She was a fallen queen in a kingdom of sand, realizing too late that the crown she had stolen was made of nothing but thorns. The final closure I had sought for so long was here, contained in these two fragments of paper. They were the last remnants of a story that had consumed my 40th year, the final proof that the destruction I had unleashed was total. I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the harbor. I thought about the woman who had stood at the table in Lou Blanc, the woman who had watched her husband and her best friend declare her obsolete. I thought about the rage that had sustained me, the cold resolve that had turned me into a ghost, and the surgical precision I had used to carve their names out of the world. A year ago, I would have taken these letters and used them as fuel. I would have drafted a devastating reply to Sebastian, mocking his legal aid as a pathetic performance. I would have sent Isabella a photo of my new office, a final twist of the knife to remind her of her exile. But as I sat there, the letters resting in the afternoon sun, I realized that responding would be an act of attachment. To scream at them, to mock them, or even to formally forgive them would be to acknowledge that they still held a seat at the table of my life. And they didn't. They had become footnotes, the before, to my after. I stood up and walked over to a filing cabinet in the corner of the room. I opened a drawer labeled Archived Projects, 2025. I didn't put the letters in the grand file, that folder had been deleted, its contents no longer relevant to the woman I was. Instead, I placed them in a plain manila folder, tucked behind the records of a closed warehouse and a settled insurance claim. As I slid the drawer shut, the metallic click echoed through the office with a finality that felt like the closing of a tomb. This was the ultimate reclamation. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of a response, nor was I going to carry the burden of their unsolicited atonement. I was filing them away, not out of malice, but out of total detachment. They were no longer the protagonists of my story, and I was no longer the antagonist of theirs. We were simply three people who had once known each other in a different life, a life that had been burned to the ground to make room for the one I was currently living. I walked back to my desk and picked up a report on the new sustainable dye vats we were installing. The weight of the past year, the betrayal, the revenge, the emptiness, and the rebirth, seemed to dissipate, leaving behind a clear, unobstructed view of the horizon. The strength to let go didn't come from a grand gesture of mercy, it came from the realization that I was simply too busy building a future to spend any more time guarding the ruins of the past. As I turned my focus back to the rhythmic thrum of the factory floor below, I felt a genuine, uncomplicated smile touch my lips. The birthday eulogy was over. The funeral for my marriage had been held, the estate had been settled, and the mourners had all gone home. I was 41 years old, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't anyone's wife, anyone's best friend, or anyone's enemy. I was Jessica, the architect of my own destiny, and the view from here was absolutely breathtaking. The first light of my 41st birthday did not filter through the heavy, velvet curtains of a penthouse designed to impress the world, it danced across the walls of my new home, a sun-drenched brownstone overlooking a quiet, leaf-strewn park. There were no orchids here, those demanding flowers that had always felt like a metaphor for my previous life, expensive, fragile, and utterly artificial. Instead, the windows were lined with hardy succulents and wild jasmine, plants that understood the necessity of roots and the quiet triumph of blooming on one's own terms. I lay in bed for a moment, listening to the city wake up, but the sound was no longer a cacophony of competing ambitions. It was a melody of possibilities. I felt a profound, resilient spirit stirring within me, a strength that wasn't forged in a courtroom or a war room, but in the slow, deliberate work of reclaiming my own humanity. The past year had been a masterclass in the ultimate reclamation. I had taken the strategic brilliance that had once been used for professional demolition and redirected it toward a purpose that finally felt as vast as the horizon. I had established the Phoenix Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to providing legal and financial sanctuary for women recovering from the devastating aftermath of financial abuse. It was my way of taking the grand file and turning it into a blueprint for survival. I spent my days in a bright, communal office, not sitting behind a mahogany fortress, but at a long table with women who had been stripped of their names and their credit, teaching them how to find the structural rot in their own histories and build something impenetrable in its place. Every time a woman regained her financial independence, I felt another layer of the old Jessica, the one who had been humiliated at Lou Blanc, transform into a luminous future. It was through this work that I met Alexander. He was a professor of modern history, a man whose intellectual curiosity was matched only by a quiet, unwavering sincerity that initially felt foreign to me. We had met at a university lecture on the ethics of corporate restructuring, an irony that hadn't been lost on me. Unlike Sebastian, who used conversation as a tool for dominance, Alexander used it as a bridge for understanding. Our connection didn't spark with the frantic, illicit heat of a betrayal, it grew with the steady, warming light of a shared truth. He was a man who preferred old libraries to exclusive clubs, and who found more beauty in a well-argued thesis than in a bespoke suit. "You have the eyes of someone who has seen the fire and decided to stay for the view," he had told me during our third dinner, a simple meal at a neighborhood bistro where no one cared about our social standing. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need to perform. I didn't need to edit my thoughts or curate my appearance to serve as his trophy. With Alexander, I was blossoming beyond betrayal. I shared the story of my 40th birthday, not as a victim seeking pity, and not as a vigilante seeking applause, but as a woman stating a fact of her history. He had listened with a profound, quiet respect, his hand resting near mine but never forcing the connection. He wasn't looking for a master orchestrator or a social queen. He was looking for me. And in the safety of his presence, I was finally finding out who that woman was. My 41st birthday was not an event. There was no guest list curated by a traitor, no emerald dresses meant to signal a funeral, and no orchestrated humiliation meant to serve as a grand finale. It was a Tuesday. I spent the morning at the foundation, watching a young mother sign the deed to her first independent apartment. I spent the afternoon walking through the park with Claire, who looked at me and finally stopped searching for the cracks in my smile. She saw that I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving in a world that had absolutely nothing to do with the people who had tried to erase me. That evening, Alexander came over. He didn't bring a diamond tennis bracelet meant to symbolize a hollow bond. He brought a first-edition collection of poetry and a bottle of wine from a small vineyard he had visited in his youth. We sat on my balcony, the park below us a sea of rustling green, and talked until the stars began to poke through the city's amber glow. "Are you happy, Jessica?" he asked, his voice a gentle anchor in the cool evening air. I had promised Sebastian that he would regret what he did, and I suppose, in his own way, he did. But the greatest triumph wasn't his regret, it was my indifference. I had risen from the ashes, not as a creature of vengeance, but as a woman of profound peace. The phoenix had finally taken flight, soaring far above the wreckage of the past, toward a horizon that was wide, bright, and entirely mine. The ultimate reclamation was complete. I wasn't just Jessica, the woman who won. I was Jessica, the woman who began. As I leaned my head against Alexander's shoulder, watching the first light of a new day begin to touch the tops of the trees, I realized that the best revenge isn't watching your enemies fall. It's reaching a place where you no longer care if they're standing at all. My life was finally my own, a masterclass in resilience and rebirth, and for the first time in 41 years, I knew exactly where I belonged. Right here. In the light. My deepest gratitude goes out to each of you for spending your valuable time here. These tales of reclaiming one's power are dedicated to the strength within us all. If you found inspiration in today's story, please consider subscribing to Queen's Revenge to stay part of this journey. What was the most moving moment for you? I read every comment and would love to learn from your insights. Thank you for being the heart of this channel.